Well, hello everyone. Welcome to the All Things Celiac webinar series brought to you by the National Celiac Association and the Harvard Medical School Celiac Education and Research Program. We are honored to have two esteemed speakers today to provide their insights on the hot topic of the gut-brain connection and celiac disease. My name is Chris Rich. I am the CEO and Executive Director for the National Celiac Association. We at NCA provide educational resources to our celiac community, such as these All Things Celiac webinar series, and we value the opportunity to continue this work in collaboration with the Harvard Medical School Celiac Education and Research Program. In addition to our educational programs, the National Celiac Association offers an extensive support network that reaches from coast to coast and assists everyone from kids and their families with our Raising Our Celiac Kids or ROC program to our focus on older generations through our Support Our Celiac Seniors initiative. You can find more information about the ways that we act as the voice of the community on our website at nationalceliac.org. The highly collaborative Harvard Medical School Celiac Education Research Program was founded in 2013 and has a twofold mission of developing and promoting the latest research in celiac disease and advancing awareness about celiac disease through educational programs to clinicians and the general public. Education is at the heart of the HMS Celiac Education and Research Program, and these webinars continue to feature multidisciplinary speakers with specialized knowledge on celiac disease, related autoimmune conditions, and nutrition. Today's session is being recorded and will be available for viewing on the National Celiac Association website. Again, that's nationalceliac.org. You can select the Resources tab from the drop-down header and click on Webinars. You can find the library of past editions of this webinar series that are available for viewing at any time, and the recording of today's session will be appearing there in approximately 5 to 7 business days. Our moderator today is Dr. Jacqueline Wolfe. Dr. Wolfe is an associate professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School in the Division of Gastroenterology at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. For over 20 years, Dr. Wolfe has focused on clinical practice, scholarly activity, teaching, and clinical research in the areas that interface women's health and gastrointestinal disorders in women. She has worked to educate patients in the community about GI health, from managing common conditions and symptoms to when to seek advice and appropriate diets that help manage medical conditions more effectively. Dr. Wolfe has served as a GI representative to the Medical Health Advisory Board of the Society for the Advancement of Women's Health Research, which promotes the inclusion of women and minorities in clinical trials, and she was on their board of directors, organizing and speaking at multiple symposia on GI problems in women. In addition, she is a founding partner for the nonprofit Foodison Health, an organization that promotes education, training, and advocacy on diets that help manage chronic health conditions. It is an impressive background, so I am honored to get things started by saying hello and welcome to Dr. Jacqueline Wolfe.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I hope you can all hear me at this point. I would like to thank Chris Rich and the National Celiac Association for presenting this webinar, which is a really important area, as the gut seems to affect everything, and our food certainly affects everything, and our body depends upon it. Today's webinar is Gut-Brain Health and Celiac Disease, Caring for Your Second Brain. CEUs are available for registered dietitians, nurses, physicians, and social workers who have pre-registered for the webinar. To receive your CEUs, please fill out the survey that will be posted in the chat section during the webinar. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Alessio Fasano and ask him to share his screen. Dr. Fasano is Chief of Pediatric Gastroenterology and Nutrition and Director of the Mucosal Immunology and Biology Research Center at Mass General for Children, and Professor of Nutrition at Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. His research focuses on bacterial pathogenesis, gut microbiome composition and function in health and disease, the regulation of gut permeability biology and immunology, and SARS-CoV-2. He is widely sought after as an expert in celiac disease, intestinal permeability, and autoimmune disorders. In addition to his role at Mass General Brigham Children's, Dr. Fasano was recently appointed as Chief Science and Medical Officer at Mead Johnson Nutrition. Thank you very much, and I would like to introduce and have Dr. Alessio Fasano start his talk.
Thank you, Jackie, for the kind introduction, and good afternoon to everybody. So I've been assigned this first part of this hour to talk about gluten in the brain, and I decided as a subtitle to use the act of serendipity or love affair. As Jackie was mentioning, I recently joined Johnson Nutrition as Chief Science and Medical Officer, but we're not going to discuss anything that relates to my role there today. Let's start from what is already one of the major controversies about, the gluten-free diet and gluten in general. There are two schools of thoughts here. The people that they eventually embrace the traditional, let's say, conservative approach, which say, you know what, only people who have been diagnosed with celiac disease belong on a gluten-free diet. And the other end of the spectrum is, who, on the other hand, said that, gluten is harmful for everybody, so everybody should go gluten-free. The reality is somewhere in the middle, of course, like anything else in life. It's true that it's not just a premise of people with celiac disease that deserve to go on a gluten-free diet. But if we look at the current landscape of people that embrace the gluten-free diet, the vast majority, they do that not for medical necessity, but because they believe, that the diet is good for them for whatever reason. And that's totally fine. But, we want to really focus our discussion, and therefore, what is the impact of gluten on the brain on the people that have to go on a gluten-free diet for medical necessity, meaning that if they do not, they have signs or symptoms that affect in a negative way their quality of life. And in that group, there are three subgroups. One that is the allergic reaction to gluten, like with allergy, a general IgE mediated, sometimes not, with the numbers that you see there, that seems to be the prevalence worldwide. Celiac disease is the autoimmune response to gluten that affects roughly 1% of the population worldwide. And then gluten sensitivity or non-celiac gluten sensitivity are also an immune response different from autoimmune or IgA-mediated allergic response. And the number is not really precise, because we don't have biomarkers there. Let me talk a little bit about celiac disease because it's the one that we know the best, because it's been on, in our radar screen for a long time. But I have to say, many things that we talk about celiac disease applies to the entire gluten, spectrum disorder. It's a unique model of autoimmunity. We know now there's no controversy that it's an autoimmune disease. It's unique because, yes, like any autoimmune disease, there is a genetic component, but some of these genes, particularly the HLA genes, they have a high penetrance, almost 100%, something that we don't see in other autoimmune disease. The autoantigen is known, that is tissue transglutaminase, or TTG for short, and we use that as a biomarker for breakthrough tolerance to gluten in terms of an autoimmune response. But what makes, celiac disease unique among all autoimmune diseases is that the environmental trigger, i.e. gluten, is known. And therefore, the elimination of the trigger leads to, in the vast majority, not always, but in the vast majority of cases, a complete resolution of the autoimmune process that can be renal if re-exposed to gluten. The connection between celiac disease and gluten happened not long ago, actually, thanks to this Dutch pediatrician that during World War II made a very acute observation. Celiac disease was known at that time, but was not known what was the trigger. And he observed that during World War II in the Dutch, kids, celiac disease that was, very impactful before the war. This is a disease for which you die. So 35-40% of these kids will die because of celiac disease and because of malnutrition, so on and so forth. The mortality rate during the war went to 0, to resurface after the war to the same 30-35%. And he wondered and reasoned, what did we miss during the war that was present and therefore was fueling the autoimmune? At that time, we didn't know there was the autoimmune, but anyhow, the inflammation of the gut that leads to malabsorption. And he reasoned that flour made with wheat was not available because at that time they used potato starch during the war. So he did an experiment that now would be, ethically totally unjustifiable, in which he took 6 babies, 6 infants, young kids with celiac disease, put them on a gluten-free diet, showed that the symptoms went away, and then re-exposed them to gluten to make them sick again. And that's how the connection between gluten and, celiac disease was made. And it's still valid nowadays. But now, fast forward to 2025, we know much, much more in terms of the pathophysiology of celiac disease. Where are in other words, all the signs and symptoms that we see in celiac disease, how they materialize, what happened there. So the old theory that was valid until the recent past was that there were two elements that were considered to be necessary and sufficient. Genetics, who you are, genetically speaking. So these were genes that was telling you HLA and many, many others that we don't know. And the environment that we know being gluten, as we said before. And the two together were considered to be necessary and sufficient to lead to the autoimmune insult, typical celiac disease in which the villi are gone. And if you subtract one of the two, in this case, you leave the gene behind, but you take gluten out, then everything goes back, to normal. That was the premise. That was the science that we were based our observation until the recent past. Now, to put all this in perspective, I also want to make not a diversion, but a precision, a statement here. For almost the totality of the 2 million years of evolution, humankind has got sick and died of only one problem: infections. That's the main reason why we were, eventually have problem in terms of morbidity and mortality. And this was until the recent past when we start to really appreciate the basics of this infection. So that's, science like microbiology, bacteriology came on board. We understood how these bugs will make us sick. And then we start to develop remedies like, the sanification of water, the advent of antibiotics, the vaccines, and so on and so forth. And in a relatively short period of time, from the late 60s until the 90s, we see a plummeting of all these infections, including rheumatic fever, hepatitis A, tuberculosis, mumps, measles, and so on and so forth. So, and this decrease, this violent decrease, was detected only in a population that embraced a Western lifestyle. What we didn't realize, we didn't calculate it, that, this comes with a price, because in that short period, so in other words, again, a drop in the bucket, the 2 million years of evolution, we realized that the people that embraced their lifestyle, yes, had less infections, but they pay a price with a dramatic increase of non-infected chronic inflammatory diseases, including, food allergies, the type 1 diabetes, multiple sclerosis, and cancer and metabolic disorders, and so on and so forth. Bottom line, if you embrace a Western lifestyle, you don't die slowly of infection, you die slowly of chronic inflammation. If you want to interpret this epidemiological phenomenon with a pessimistic point of view, of course, the gene's mutation takes much longer than 20 years, 30 years. So we change the environment too fast for us to adapt as a species. That's one way to interpret that. But if we want to interpret with a more optimistic approach, the same phenomenon can teach us a totally different lesson. In the past, we thought that if I'm born with the genes for breast cancer or type 1 diabetes or celiac disease, that's my destiny. That I can't do anything about it. This epidemiological phenomenon here suggests otherwise. It depends. If we play our genetic cards in a wrong way, yes, that genetic predisposition would materialize in clinical outcome. So the major challenge and opportunity that we have nowadays is to understand what we have been doing wrong in the Western Hemisphere to fuel this, surge of these chronic inflammatory diseases so that we can place some remedies. And what we learned was another lesson. Yes, genes and environment are necessary, but not sufficient. There are at least another 3 elements at play. These 2 words are segregated by barrier. The ones that we see all the time is the skin, but they are much more bigger and more sophisticated barriers, including, the intestine, because it's the large interface, the one that's been studied the most, and so on and so forth. So a loss of segregation because the intestine leaks seems to be important. The 4th element, we're talking about chronic inflammation, it got to be in the immune system, become hyper-belligerent. And last and not least, in terms of importance, this ecosystem for which we know little, that we call the microbiome, this parallel world that we are living with, and in collaboration and in synergy with, from birth to death, seems to be extremely important. These last 3, they seem to influence each other. But one of the major lessons that we learn, even in celiac disease, It's the microbiome that decide if, when, why, how these genes will be turned on and off to start that march from genetic predisposition to clinical outcome, what we called technically epigenetics. So what about celiac disease? Is the same story? Absolutely. We've seen in celiac disease the same surge of incidence of celiac disease over time. Celiac disease double every 15 years in any of the country that, its presence where the genetic is compatible. So, yeah, like for any other chronic inflammatory disease, genes and gluten are necessary but not sufficient. There are other stuff at play, and this other stuff is the microbiome. As a matter of fact, now we know that there is this march that is exemplified in this cartoon. It's been quite well determined. So if we go from left, number 1, state of health, to 4, right, there is the state of disease. That's what happened at the mucosal level. Again, the example is intestine, but this applies to the airways or the blood-brain barrier, matter of fact. So number 1, everything is physiologically appropriate. The barrier works. The bad guys are kept at bay outside our body. The microbiome is in a symbiotic relationship with us. The trafficking of molecule from the external world into our body is tightly regulated. So everything seems to be in what we call a state of tolerance or mucosal energy. The problem arises when you go from point 1 to point 2, i.e. there is an exaggerated trafficking of stuff from the external world into our body because increased permeability. Keep in mind that until the recent past, we thought that everything that comes from outside into our body has to go through the cell because in between cells there was a sort of cement that sealed everything. Now we know that it's not the case. There are structures highly dynamic that we call disjunctions that can be conceptualized as a sort of door, most of the time closed. But if open, they allow stuff to come in. And if they're open for too long, inappropriately too long, that will give the shortcut to stuff to come in. And if we have an invasion of these enemies, the immune system does what is programmed to do. There is enemy, I fight, and I get rid of them. And they use tools like cytokines, including TNF-alpha and interferon gamma, that per se increase gut permeability. Now you move from 2 to 3, and you got in this vicious circle. Antigen comes in, inflammation is generated, mediated by pro-inflammatory cytokines that increase even more, permeability until you break tolerance and you develop a problem. Which one depends who you are, genetically speaking. You are predisposed, for a functional disorder where you develop IBS, a Th1 immune response cancer, Th2 allergy, Th17 autoimmune, and so on and so forth. The challenge was how you move from 1 to 2. And that's been our contribution, discovering this, group of molecules, a family of proteins that we call zonulins, that now have been objects of almost more than 1,000 papers, linking them to a variety of conditions that you see here: metabolic disorder, aging, infection, cancer, and so on and so forth. I put in highlight red the conditions in which the brain seems to be involved. And of course, celiac disease in green, because you have an increase of zonulin also in celiac disease as one of the 5 pillars that I was saying necessary to develop any chronic inflammation, including celiac disease. How you produce too much zonulin? There are several stimuli. One happened to be gluten. Here you have a cartoon of gliadin, one of the key components of gluten. And you probably know, but it's worth it to remember that, this is a mix of very peculiar proteins because they are very rich in some amino acids, particularly prolamine and glutamine, that makes these peptides not completely digestible. So the best that we can do as a human being is to digest in fragments that cannot be further digested, that you see color-coded here. In blue, you see the ones that communicate with the host, instigating the release of an exaggerated amount of zonulin. So gluten per se, through those 2 blue peptides, is capable to tell to the cell, produce zonulin beyond what is necessary. Coming to what is the outcome of all this is that celiac disease, again, and there was another confusing factor, is not just a gastrointestinal disorder. Yes, the inflammation starts the intestine, but it really can touch any tissue organ, to the point that in this editorial I wrote a long time ago that celiac disease is really a clinical chameleon. This is the classical celiac disease that we rarely see anymore. So a malabsorption syndrome like the one that we see nowadays, the kids that are malnourished, as we see in Gaza, for example. But we don't see this anymore. That's not celiac disease. Celiac disease is a condition now that touches any single tissue organ. And among them, there are some that are very peculiar. Now, this concept that even if you have a condition in the gut can spread all over your body, it was already put out from the father of all the physician, Hippocrates, said, almost 2,500 years ago, all diseases begin in the gut. In 2010, when I wrote my first book on gluten freedom, I put this, new version that the gut is not like Las Vegas. What happened in the gut does not stay in the gut, meaning that the gut is really a battlefield where friends and foes needs to be recognized to manage the balance between tolerance and immune response. And all the manifestation that, there is no tissue organ that is spared by the inflammatory process instigated by celiac disease. The brain seems to be one of the most, targeted organ for reason that now just we start to understand, to the point in which no matter what kind of gluten-related disorder you have, celiac disease, gluten sensitivity with allergy, there are people that experience, and if there are patients in our audience, they will be, tuned in this kind of concept. Chronic headache, short memory loss, anxiety, depression, autism, ADHD, ataxia, seizures, irritability, all the way to schizophrenia, as we will hear from a second from Dr. Kelly. So, and there is a major link between, digestion and behavior, so that we know that autistic kids develop intestinal symptoms, diarrhea, and so on and so forth. So we know there is this communication. That the brain communicates with the gut was known for a long, long time. That's the way that, we somatize when we are nervous or anxious, we have stomachache. But that the gut can communicate with the brain is a relatively more recent evidence. How? Three main ways that the gut communicates with the brain. One, through the nervous system, the vagus. So stuff that happens in the gut can be transmitted and change, our behavior. Or through the production of specific, hormones. Most famous nowadays, GLP-1 agonist, that is the one that control our suppression of appetite, Ozempic, to understand what I'm talking about. And then the third has to do with antigen trafficking, so intestinal barrier permeability, and molecules that from the ecosystem, the microbiome produced there, may eventually travel through the bloodstream into the brain to do what? To change our eating behavior, our cognition, impulsivity, anxiety, depression, and many other concepts that you will hear in a moment. And again, another people that I just wrote, The Physiology of Hunger, it's another way that exemplify how the gut really can control our behavior, in this case, the appetite or hunger, even through, mechanisms that are all due to the microbiota. And that leads me to my wrap it up. So under physiological circumstances, if we have a healthy barrier and keep the enemies at bay, this, state of health of the gut translate in the state of the health of the brain. If, on the other hand, you have a imbalance of the microbiome, so it is biosis in which, bad guys, what we call the pathobiome, that they take over, they can induce an increased permeability because they stimulate an increased gut permeability. And in that, you can eventually have an abnormal behavior, cognition, stress response, visceral pain, and so on and so forth. So bottom line, healthy gut, healthy brain. Sick gut, sick brain. And, again, now the issue is that some of these microbes, they can by itself, if transmitted to a host, for example, from one mouse to another, can change the behavior of the receiving mouse to the point they're called psychobiotics. Back to zone and gut permeability inflammation, what are the mechanisms that they really do this? There are two that have been hypothesized. One that, more gliadin has undigested fragment that I showed you before that also mimic the function of some, molecules that control our behavior, like endorphins, to the point they're called gliadorphins. The other possibility, again, a non-alternative but possible complementary, is the mechanism that I showed you before. So an increased inflammation and therefore neuroinflammation due to an increased antigen traffic and so on and so forth. So with that, I believe that I generated what could be the premise to give now the words to my colleagues that will be introduced again by Dr. Wolf, that will go a little bit more in details on neuroinflammation and how this translates in clinical outcome.
Thank you. That was a fantastic talk, Dr. Fasano, and it really sets us up for understanding where the next speaker, Dr. Kelly, is going to go and talk about the brain and gluten. Prior to that, I just want to remind everyone to put their questions in the Q&A or the chat if that works better for you. I would like to introduce Dr. Kelly. Dr. Deanna Kelly is the Dr. William and Carol Carpenter Professor of Psychiatry for Mental Illness Research at the University of Maryland School for Medicine and is currently serving as the acting director of the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center. She has 27 years of experience in clinical trials, particularly in people with psychotic disorders and schizophrenia. Dr. Kelly is a leader in the field of psychiatry in studying dietary and supplemental interventions and testing the role of gluten and mental health. She has over 240 published peer-reviewed scientific papers, 20 books and chapters, and has given over 190 invited lectures. And in fact, her new book is being released on Get Your Brain Off Grain. She has been awarded the Maltz Prize for Innovative and Promising Schizophrenia Research by the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation for her work on gluten and schizophrenia. She has been featured in many media outlets, and I know it will be many more. I would like to introduce Dr. Deanna Kelly to start her slides.
Thank you, Dr. Wolf, for that introduction, and thanks, Alessio, for your wonderful presentation. I met Dr. Fasano over 15 years ago, and he taught me everything that I knew in the field of gastroenterology in the early years, so I really appreciate it. Can everyone hear me okay? Good. So I'm going to be talking about this from a different standpoint. So my training has been in mental health, in clinical trials, and in understanding new treatments for people with mental health disorders and mental illness. And I really converged over 15 years ago with Dr. Fasano when we started to find that people who had psychiatric illnesses were connected to potentially celiac disease and other gluten-related disorders. And so my work has been understanding this as a mechanism by which people might develop mental health conditions, mental health problems, or exacerbate them. So I'm going to be talking today about the psychiatric and biologic implications of gluten-related disorders. My disclosures are here, nothing directly related to this talk today. And our learning objectives you all have, but I'm going to be talking about, like I said, gluten's relationship to mental health and neurological conditions, and some of the work that we've done looking at gluten-free diets in this space and why gluten is important to the brain. I will start off by, this is sort of reiterates, I have a couple slides that kind of play along with Dr. Fasano's slides, but again, this gut-brain connection is really important. Dr. Fasano came from, started with the gut side of things, and I started with the brain side of things, and we've both learned over time that this is a bi-directional communication. So we can communicate both ways through potentially the microbiome, neurotransmitters, and other ways that these are communicating. But if you as he mentioned, if you get, we've all had those butterflies in our stomach or that gut feeling, and that's because our stomach functions as a second brain, and this communication is undoubtedly a real thing. I wanted to start by showing you this paper that came out in 2023. I recently came across it this past year. What was interesting is these were just in regular research mice. And what they did is a 14-week study, and they looked at a low-fat diet, a high-fat diet, a low-fat diet with gluten added, and a high-fat diet with gluten added. So they had 4 groups, and they over 14 weeks, they fed the mice these 4 different groups. What they found on the side of on the weight side of things is actually on the high-fat diet, both of the mice gained weight, but those who had gluten added gained additional weight. And in those with the 2 low-fat diets, those with gluten added had higher inflammation markers in the blood. And this was significantly different. And these are just in regular mice, not mice set up to be a strain that has markers for celiac or a model for celiac, but in all mice. And it really just got me thinking about gluten in general and how gluten does impact the body and potentially the brain. Look at this slide here. These are pictures of astrocytes. And astrocytes are brain cells. They respond to injury. If you take a look on the left-hand side, these are slices of the brains of these mice after a low-fat diet and a high-fat diet. And this is astrocytes that are found. You can see it's darker. It's staining for these cells. That means that the astrocytes after gluten added in both the low-fat diet and high-fat diet were significantly higher in these slices of the brain. So because gluten was added, there were more of these cells that are responding to injury and disease. And then following on to that, there's cells in the brain called microglia. And microglia are like our immune cells that are in our brains, doing the work that other cells would be doing in the periphery. And the same thing is true. When gluten's added, there are more of these cells in the slices of the brain after being fed gluten for 14 weeks, which is really intriguing, the fact that somehow the brain is having an immune response now when people are fed or when animals are fed gluten. So how is the brain impacted? Dr. Fasano talked about this, and he showed a very similar slide. This is a schematic of ours, but it's very similar. Again, zonulins included, intestinal barrier permeability happens. We get inside, we have everything he talked about happening. But we do know that now we have this direction back to the brain now. And we know that inflammatory markers potentially can cross the blood-brain barrier and the brain can be involved, like I had mentioned. So I have a little quiz for everyone. If everyone wants to put up their cell phone to this QR code, if you want to try this out and see if this works. But I'm wondering for everyone on the call, for families, for people who have a celiac disease or non-celiac gluten sensitivity caregivers, have you seen any brain-related issues connected to the disorder? Go ahead and start here. I'll see if I can get this. Whoops, I'll take that back. So we can see here, just hold your phone up. You have all the questions on there, and I can scan down. Good. So you can see these answers coming in. And so across the board, and I think we have some additional ones below the screen as well that are showing up, but across the board, we are seeing brain fog. Over 80% of people with brain fog. So the brain is impacted, fogginess, cognitive issues, etc. Anxiety is very common. Headaches are common. And you can see here, this is greater than 50% of people. And this is, again, that's what the literature shows, that 60-70% of people have depressive symptoms, ADHD, autism. We have seizure disorders, other things associated with it. So thank you all for sort of sharing that anonymously so we can get a handle on that. But you can see how these issues are across the board happening in people who have these gluten-related disorders. As Dr. Fasano pointed out, in celiac disease, we have antibodies that we can help diagnose this, and done very well. And he also mentioned there's this gluten sensitivity group we don't have biomarkers for, and people can medically feel better in terms of their stomach and GI issues, potentially also some of their psychiatric symptoms. Some of the work we've done, we've been trying to help identify some people where they can feel better that don't have celiac disease. And we've identified and looked at antibodies that are present in wheat. They're not specific for celiac disease, as Dr. Fasano pointed out, but we've been able to find those who have immune reactions happening in their body, and that relates to mental health as well. So I'm going to talk about these gliadin antibodies. They're antibodies to wheat specifically, that it's separate domain than celiac disease. And we're going to talk about both of those as we talk about the brain's impact. Some of our work coming from the mental health side, we have been screening people for several years, looking at celiac disease risk and having antibodies to gliadin and immune response to gluten in the body. What's interesting is, and Dr. Fasano alluded to it, is that there are many people that are potentially undiagnosed. We looked at TTG antibodies in those who had no psychiatric diagnosis. And again, these are people already screened out for having celiac disease. So in addition to the 1% or more of the population that we know are healthy controls, we find that about 2.3% of the population are being missed, and they have TTG antibodies and didn't know they have it. They're coming more in for more of issues related to the brain. Even those with no psychiatric diagnoses that have things like joint pain, fogginess, etc., come in and undiagnosed potential celiac. In those who have depression and bipolar, we're finding 3% of people have antibodies and don't know it. They're first seeking treatment for mental health care. And those with the illness schizophrenia that I study primarily, again, almost 2%. So very common that we still see people who have celiac disease and don't know it, and their primary concerns are related to the brain. So that's an important piece. Not everybody mental health is related to this, but we do have people. This data shows us these gliadin antibodies that I was talking about. We were trying to identify these subgroups of people with mental health conditions and how they might differ from the healthy population who come from mental health concerns. And what we found is that these anti-gliadin antibodies, again, not specific for celiac disease, but potentially higher in those who are having inflammation in the brain. We see them about 33% of people who have schizophrenia, and others have replicated this, and we have replicated this several times. So I pretty much say that a third of our patients with serious mental illness, and this is true, these are found in depression, et cetera, too, have these higher elevated antibodies. So their body is responding to gliadin and forming antibodies against it, not necessarily always having celiac, but gluten is impacting them in some way. What's interesting is this is a group from Johns Hopkins, but they looked at schizophrenia and healthy control. So those with mental health conditions and those who did not, and looked at cerebral spinal fluid as well as blood. And they found these antibodies to be correlated in the brain and in the blood in people with mental health conditions like schizophrenia, suggesting that the blood-brain barrier is permeable. We know that the gut can be permeable, and zonulin can contribute to tight junction permeability, but the blood-brain barrier, that's the network that keeps things out of the brain, also might be separating so that things can get into the brain who should not be getting in the brain, leading to things like brain fogginess, depression, anxiety, and other symptoms, however they might be manifested. So when I talk about schizophrenia a lot today, it's not unique to this disorder that we have brain complications and mental health conditions. I've been able to study this very clearly, though. In this subgroup of people, then, if you look at them that have these high antibodies, we also can show two things here. This is inflammation in the blood and in the body, and then over here, inflammation in the brain. So in this group of people, the more the higher the immune response to gluten that's happening, the higher the inflammatory markers are in the body and the brain. And we've been able to show that and publish on both of those. In fact, new data from our group shows that white matter, so some of the connections in the brain, so this is a picture of someone who's a jazz improviser over here, and these are like white matter tracks. They connect from one area, sending messages to another when we look at connectivity across the brain. And what we find is that people who have these antibodies have less connectivity in the brain. So we were able to show this in a recent study. So there is definitely the impacting of the brain in some people who have gluten-related disorder. This is a real thing. We can show this. There was a paper that came out many years ago, and it was a person with schizophrenia who had celiac disease, and they had some early brain imaging. And when they went on a gluten-free diet, their symptoms went completely away. And this made me think, oh my goodness, like we could possibly intervene in people with immune response to gluten and improve their symptoms with a gluten-free diet, improve their brain symptoms, not necessarily their gut symptoms, but improve how they might function or behave. And so this led to some of the work that we've done. Dr. Fasano helped me in the initial studies. We initially did a study 1, which is a pilot study, and found that people with schizophrenia treated with a gluten-free diet, their symptoms got better. And then this was study number 2. It was our first, what we call a double-blind, randomized, controlled trial, where we took people from the outside, admitted them to an inpatient setting so we could control for the diet, we could control for the environment, their microbiome, etc. And we gave everybody a gluten-free diet for 5 weeks. And daily, people either received they received protein shakes of either gluten flour or rice flour, so that no one knew if they were taking gluten or not in the study. And we wanted to see how their psychiatric symptoms really changed in the study. This is a measure of psychiatric symptoms in people with schizophrenia. And what it's showing is that improvement is going down. So the orange line is the gluten-free diet. And we could, within 2 weeks, really improve symptoms with large effect sizes that we see. And those who treated with gluten, their psychiatric symptoms did not change. So we could show that people got better behaviorally, again, in a very well-controlled study, suggesting that removing gluten really plays an impact in some people. These people were all those people only positive for gliadin antibodies. So I'm not suggesting that this would be true for everybody, but those who have celiac disease and those who might have an immune response to gluten with some gliadin antibodies, or those with non-celiac gluten sensitivity, might have improvement with a gluten, or definitely suggesting that there could be an improvement in brain symptoms or mental health conditions with gluten removal. And then we just finished our 3rd study, a replication study, and we find symptoms improve as well, but we also did brain imaging this time. And this is a fun graphic that the imaging team developed for me, but it shows that relative to the gluten-containing group, those people on the gluten-free diet group had increased blood flow over 5 weeks when they took gluten away. So you can see in the whole frontal regions of the brain here, and you can see all through the brain, those from green, yellow, or the orange up into red, where blood flow is starting to flow again and improving brain function potentially, or improving how the brain's functioning when gluten's removed in this subgroup. It's profound how we can have some changes. Again, this is a subgroup of people with an immune response to gluten measured by these antibodies as our way of identifying a subgroup, but it's showing you that the brain can be connected and that blood flow changes could change when we take away gluten. However, my work is in schizophrenia is only one piece of one illness where the brain can be impacted. In fact, there's data, as Dr. Fasano pointed out, in many different psychiatric illnesses. So when we have leaky blood-brain barrier, when we have communication to the brain that might be disrupted, this could occur in a variety of ways. And so anxiety disorders are common. And you saw that anxiety was one of the most common reported in the group today. We were looking at 75% of people saying that they have had anxiety. And that has been linked. Not everybody with anxiety has gluten issues, but certainly gluten has been linked. And this is just some data where I was showing you 67 to 85%, just like the group on today, have anxiety. There's studies actually showing that in people who have anxiety disorders or celiac disease, celiac disease is more common if they have anxiety disorders. There is also a study with 40 people showing that a gluten-free diet relative to a gluten-containing diet improved anxiety symptoms. And in fact, of all the mental health symptoms they studied, anxiety improved the most. So anxiety has a pretty good link to mental health conditions. And it is a predictor when kids come in early and young, as a 5-year predictor for those who might develop schizophrenia along with gut symptoms. So anxiety plays a role. There's many case reports out there and other studies as well. The book that they mentioned today that's coming out talks a lot about, we have chapters on each one of these psychiatric disorders in there, talking about all the literature that exists. But it's not just true for anxiety disorders. There's ADHD where there's evidence as well. In fact, in the general population of healthy individuals, or what we call healthy individuals, Celiac disease is about 1% of the population, but in those with ADHD, that risk goes up to about 1.4% of the population. So there is this connection in ADHD as well. And there's just some evidence that I list here about the relationship and studies of connecting ADHD and celiac disease. And so even newly diagnosed celiac patients who completed in one study this ADHD symptom checklist, scores are higher on ADHD. And then after a gluten-free diet, they could return to baseline like the healthy control. So there are symptoms, and sometimes these can mimic attention and deficit and more hyperactivity symptoms. As Dr. Fasano also pointed out, autism, there's some controversy. There's been many studies in this area. Some studies have not shown benefit, others have. But parents generally report that their patients, that their family members, their children are on special diets. Many of you on the call who have maybe autism spectrum disorder children in your families, etc., might be using special diets, even though they might not be diagnosed with celiac disease. So there is improvements noted, and there have been studies of autism spectrum disorder symptoms improving on gluten-free diets. So more work is needed here, but this is certainly an area that obviously a lot of people have been very interested in looking at. The link to depression is also there as well. I'm just being going through all these disorders. There's fewer existing studies, but there's larger ones underway. But we do know, and we have 2 studies out there showing that people who've had depressive symptoms and got better, if you reintroduce gluten, their symptoms of depression worsen. And so those exist. There's also several case reports out there. I have a few examples listed as well, and we have a chapter on depression as well. Dr. Fasano mentioned about neurological conditions. We do know about gluten ataxia. It's a real thing. It's called gluten ataxia. People who have off-balance issues might have this is related to gluten, and potentially areas of the back of the brain like the cerebellum play a role in that. And gluten antibodies can attack some of the cells in that area of the brain. We also know about encephalopathy, having brain inflammation, et cetera, other neurologic symptoms. And we know that epilepsy, and I have been consulted on a few recent cases where children who have had seizures and the family thought it was related to gluten, and we have found antibodies to gliadin or undiagnosed celiac disease when presenting as epilepsy. Often there's some calcifications, and we've been seeing those in people telling me about their scans showing calcifications, but we do know about that as well. I'm going to close up and end by another thought around this and why some of the work that we do. So the microbiome might be important, the communication between the gut and the brain through the nerves, between chemicals. But there's also this idea of mimicry, this idea that things in the body are mistaken for gluten is potentially a real part of the story. And what we did, so there's some papers out there showing that glutamate plays a role in is a neurotransmitter in the brain that plays a role with a lot of our psychiatric disorders. And it might be playing a role in depression or schizophrenia or anxiety. But a subunit protein of this receptor, the glutamate receptor, I put a picture of it up here. But here's what it sort of looks like. There's fragments of gliadin, as Dr. Fasano pointed out. There's all these fragments, hard to digest, but there's a fragment. It's called the 33-mer gliadin. It's a fragment of it that looks very similar. And in fact, if you do an analysis to look at the protein structure, the protein structures look very similar. So it's possible that our bodies see gluten and then form antibodies because they think that it looks like a piece of our brain potentially attacking the receptors in our own brain. It's a theory. We're working on this. We have data to suggest that these antibodies to this receptor are higher in people who have gluten antibodies. So in fact, those who have anti-gliadin antibodies seem to have higher GRIN1 antibodies as well. And so it's suggesting that our theory is really worth testing. And so this mimicry may be leading to the inflammation in the brain from this mimicry story as well. But this is just a theory. This is work, but I'm showing you that we know the connection is there. We can show changes in the brain, and we're trying to figure out why that's the case. And so in summary, I'm reiterating what we've been talking about today, that psychiatric symptoms are often present. As we saw today, you all said that psychiatric symptoms, mental health conditions are prevalent. Not all psychiatric symptoms are due to gluten, but some may be. And so a gluten-free diet not necessarily is for everyone. And so in that tug of war, we're not at the point that this is for everyone. But it was interesting that there was the early mice study that I showed you that gluten contributed to extra inflammation in the brain. So we have a lot to learn, but we do know that there is, in humans, we see that there are lots of people that do have mental health conditions for which gluten might play a role. So it is important that you don't stop your mental health medications because you think gluten-free diet will work for that. I would suggest on the psychiatric side of things, you talk to your physician. You make sure that they know, and you're in your team, that the gut symptoms you're having could be related to your brain, because psychiatry and gastroenterology have traditionally not talked well. So we isolate these, and they're not necessarily should be isolated. So they should be treated together and recognize that they potentially occur together. So in summary, celiac disease and potentially a gluten sensitivity group, they're not just diseases of the gut, but the brain is highly connected. And I hope that my work just showed you that this is a real thing, and there's lots of research underway to help figure this situation and help figure out this connection. So thank you so much.
I would like to thank Dr. Kelly for this beautiful talk that is really stimulating for getting us going with our question and answer session with our panelists. I also want to say there's a lot more research that Dr. Kelly is doing and Dr. Alessio is doing, and I think we'll be watching this over the years to answer many of the questions that are being asked. I will not be able to get to all the questions, but I'm hoping we will be able to answer as many as possible. And I want to thank everybody for submitting your questions. There were also a number of questions that were submitted prior to this, and I've tried to put them all together. Many have been the same, so if I don't get to your question, please understand and try to see if you can find it also in the literature. So the first one is that, and you had just addressed this at the very end, does the microbiome determine or affect the celiac disease, and can it be modified to decrease the risk of celiac disease? i.e., will bone broth help? Prebiotics, probiotics, and is there a specific prebiotic, probiotic that you recommend?
All right, so this will take an entire, session, but to make a long story short, as I mentioned in my talk, like any other chronic inflammatory diseases, the microbiome may be influential to decide your clinical destiny, for better, for worse. So this is the hypothesis. The only way to prove that is to look at the march. And for the past 15 years, thanks to the NIH, we've been doing this study, a prospective study from birth of kids at risk. Because if you do this on people already with celiac disease and you detect a difference in the microbiome, you don't know if this is a cause or the consequence. But if you have a march, so you see these kids from birth, and then eventually you note a shift of the microbiome that precedes the onset of disease, and mechanistically you can make the link, that's a different story. And that's what we are doing with this study that's called the CDGEM, that is a multi-omic study that looks also at the microbiome. And to make a long story short, yes, there is a quote-unquote signature that predict with more than 90% of who will be in a genetically risk, because these are infants that are the father and mother, brother, sister with celiac disease, who will down the road will develop celiac disease. And the signature is you lose protective elements. In other words, microbes that can put a brake on inflammation, and you have an excess of the one that can create too much inflammation. So one idea in the future, and that's what we're doing now as a clinical trial, is to supplement these protective elements, and we know how they work, by the way, to the kids when they have that shift that predict with a great level of confidence, and down the road, a year later, we develop celiac disease to see if you can intercept that. Bone broth or any other products that can be quote unquote good for gut health, that's not, an area in which we have a strong evidence. But I don't want to give you the false, sense that tomorrow you go to CVS, you buy the probiotics, and that will fix the problem. We are far from there.
Yeah, and I was just going to add too on the mental health side of things, with the microbiome being so important, we have clinical trials going on this space as well. And for example, we're trying to target certain bacteria species in the gut that might increase short chain fatty acids, which we think could potentially help cognitive function. There's evidence of that in animal models. And so some of our initial studies have shown that giving a prebiotic, which a prebiotic is the food that sort of feeds some bacteria in the colon we're targeting, and we've been able to show we can increase these short chain fatty acids slightly and improve cognitive functioning in very preliminary studies. And so we're at the very, very beginning of this, and we have a lot to understand, but it's suggesting that modulating gut bacteria could play a role, but we have a lot to understand there for sure.
Thank you. There have been a number of other things. It's why is celiac disease connected to other autoimmune diseases? Could it be a gene mutation or environmental factors, which you have talked about? And I can also say that irritable bowel syndrome, you talk about the microbiome, that also seems to be impacted and also impacts the nerves. So if you can comment on that, that would be great.
Yeah. So there are two schools of thoughts that they are not mutually exclusive why celiac disease and high comorbidity with other autoimmune disease. One seems to suggest what we call linkage between genes that, put you at risk for more than a single autoimmune disease. So you have the genes for celiac disease. Now you also have the genes, because they travel together, that puts you at risk of type 1 diabetes, Hashimoto, thyroiditis, Sjogren's syndrome. In other words, all the comorbidity that we are aware. There's another theory, actually, that say, well, if we have one that is not treated, you have an increased risk to develop another one. In other words, if you have celiac disease not treated, so your gut is damaged, the inflammation is ongoing, antigen trafficking and stuff comes all the time because of destruction of the barrier, you have also now the same premise that can lead you to the BRCA tolerance and develop other autoimmune disease if you also have the genes for this other condition. So in other words, celiac disease can be the precondition for the others. The reality of the story that we don't know for sure, and again, I don't think that we have, all the elements to say is a linkage disequilibrium genetics or is one that lead into the other. But, some of the more recent data suggests that your risk to develop other autoimmune disease, if you make an early diagnosis and implement your gluten-free diet correctly, the risk for other autoimmune disease decreases compared to the ones that will not eventually have a prompt intervention.
Thank you. That also leads to another question for Dr. Kelly. If you have undiagnosed celiac disease for over 10 years or longer, will that make the brain manifestations worse, or that they won't heal better, you'll get better decrease symptoms when you go on a gluten-free diet? What do you think about that? And brain fog clearly is what a lot of people think about, and people are worried about dementia as they age.
Yeah, no, good question. And Dr. Fasano might want to comment on this too. But I don't know all the answers here. Certainly, the evidence with things like gluten ataxia, where we have ataxic symptoms, and we know that the gluten is impacting like the Purkinje cell, these cells in the cerebellum. If you go undiagnosed, you can't recover some of those, and people will have symptoms that can't be as recovered as well as they could if you catch it right away. In terms of the work that we're doing, we have been able to show people who have had chronic symptoms still get better. So it has not been, it doesn't appear to me empirically that people don't have the chance to still get better if they have had, but I mean, obviously I'm talking about mental health conditions, the gut, et cetera, obviously is a different story, but I don't know the answers. We don't have a lot of studies in this space. So we don't really know if someone goes along, how long, like I'm not aware of studies where showing how long you have undiagnosed celiac changes on how well you can improve or not improve. We just don't know that. So I don't know if Dr. Fasano wants to say any more, but yeah.
Yeah, I'm totally in agreement with Deanna. You know, we unfortunately, well-designed study to answer this question are not there. There are a couple of issues to be, pointed out though, and that's intuitive. If the because it's all neuroinflammation, if the neuroinflammatory process did not cause a scar, so something that cannot be fixed, technically, if you stop inflammation, that should regain that function. But, that, for example, we know this for not central nervous system, but peripheral neuropathy due to gluten. That's exactly what happened. If you do this diagnosis on time, you regain the function. If you do this too late, that that nerve is being substituted or partially infiltrated by fibrotic tissue, there is no regain. You don't get worse, but there is no regain of function. Comes to dementia, comes to eventually mental deterioration. These are complex and not well understood mechanisms that it's hard to say. Foggy brain, on the other hand, and this happens in clinic, we see this all the time. No matter how long you've been having foggy mind, but if you were fueled by neuroinflammatory process due to gluten, it's magic. These people, they go gluten-free, and now they think straight. They can do math. They remember where they put their keys, stuff that, they didn't have the chance to do for many, many years.
So going back to your brain fog and gluten, has long COVID been associated with developing celiac disease?
So when we were in the midst of COVID pandemic, the NIH asked specifically us to answer two questions. One is, does COVID increase the chance of autoimmunity, including celiac disease? And the converse also was asked. If I have celiac disease, do I have more chance to develop COVID and eventually long COVID? So the first question was answered by a resounding no. So in other words, if you have COVID, that will not increase your risk to develop celiac disease. This was the original response that was given right away by many, many investigators. Of course, my caveat there said, well, we got to see this more on the long term and see how this works. But so far, there are no additional evidence that, if you had COVID, or even long COVID, you increase your chance to develop celiac disease. And again, also the opposite seems to not pan out. So in other words, if you have, celiac disease, it's not that you have a high risk to develop long COVID. The caveat there that some of the symptoms, there are a lot of overlapping between, celiac disease not well controlled and long COVID. So there can be some confusion there eventually.
Thank you. Another question that's come up is, since we know a lot of the serotonin is in the gut, 95% maybe, what happens to the serotonin level in people with celiac disease? And is this different, if we know it, in people with mental health disorders? And in addition, because of that, is there an SSRI, which if someone needs it for therapy, would be better in mental health issues associated with celiac disease?
So I answer the first, and then I have Deanna to tell the next. I'm unaware that serotonin levels are increasing in people with celiac disease. For the rest, Deanna definitely is much more qualified than me to answer that.
Yeah, no, I don't know of data either on that. But I mean, the person who's asking this is right, that the serotonin, there's a lot of serotonin in the gut. What's interesting is that what makes serotonin is tryptophan, which is an amino acid. And actually, the majority of amino acid breakdown forms something, 95% is actually formed for something called kynurenic acid, and 5% goes to serotonin. So we have another whole pathway in there related to mental health conditions as well. the microbiome and the gut permeability impacts that dramatically. So the byproducts of like breaking down this amino acid changes then the amount of kynurentic acid, which in theory could then change a little bit about how serotonin is produced as well. And we have data on the kynurentic acid pathway, but we don't know serotonin levels and SSRI selecting amongst, it's really hard to know. We don't have clinical trials that tell us like which one would be better in celiac disease and not celiac disease. But around the SSRIs, they're very similar. They differ mainly in like how long they're in the body. Obviously, some people can do some well and others and not others, but they're very similar in their mechanism. So we don't anticipate that serotonin levels in the gut would really change which one we should pick. But we don't have a lot of good information. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And here's one which we also probably, it's a difficult question. Given the mechanism we know for reduction of gluten and its improvement both in non-gluten, non-celiac gluten sensitivity and celiac disease, what is the overall gestalt about trying to decrease grains in the Western diet through our nutrition programs nationally?
Oh boy, it's a politically loaded question, actually. I will respond as a nutritionist. If we didn't have grain, we would still jump from one tree to another because grain was part of the agricultural revolution 10,000 years ago. The price that unfortunately people that for medical necessity, they need to go on a gluten-free diet is not trivial because you lose the component that are fundamentally important for our diet, i.e. one of the best source of fibers. And the Western lifestyle already is poor fibers. Now you go gluten-free and it's even less. But the cost-benefit ratio, if you have celiac disease or non-celiac gluten sensitivity, of course, wait for going gluten-free. Now you go to the next level, all the grains out. I believe that would be an extreme, approach that has no fundamental science to justify, that kind of extreme diet. Because, you really need to find alternative way to supplement that minimal amount of fibers and minerals and vitamins that come with grains that are fundamentally important for our good gut health, so to speak.
Yeah, and folate is certainly something that's important for good mental health, and we would lose folate potentially because they're fortified in breads and cereals. So you'd have to supplement, et cetera. But certainly, I mean, in general, as we talk not just about celiac disease, but we talk about our dietary pyramid, we have been very, very heavy in the grains. And so the idea of fewer carbs and moving that pyramid around a little bit potentially is work that's probably happening right now, because the grains do not need to be the entire, the most important source of our diet. We're starting to learn that other fruits and vegetables, potentially healthier, some healthy fats like avocados, coconut oil, things like that are important. So maybe it's supplementing more of that. So our food pyramid does need a little bit of overhaul, and so that we're not completely grain heavy. But as I agree with everything Dr. Fasano said about.
So I think because we're running out of time, I think this is a really important question for individuals with celiac disease. Aside from following a strict gluten-free diet, what daily life tips do you have to help foster a healthy gut-brain connection and function?
All right, so that applies to healthy lifestyle. I would say mine and Deanna, I'm pretty sure that she will weigh in. So the westernization of lifestyle brought us to the disaster that we have right now in terms of the surge of chronic inflammatory disease, including gluten-related disorders. So what brought there? Excessive use of antibiotics. We born much more frequently by C-section, even when it's not medically necessary. Level of stress, exposure to pollutants, but of all this, depending where you live. But the common denominator is diet. These bugs, they eat what we eat, and they dictate our clinical destiny. So I am redundant by saying, besides being gluten-free, having healthy diets, healthy lifestyle, meaning, be physically and mentally active, have a good, sleep hygiene, try to minimize the level of stress, are the obvious, low-hanging fruit. Some easier than others, of course, but, you can eat as healthy if you want. You sit 10 hours on a couch, that doesn't work. Vice versa, you can be a super athlete and you eat junk, that doesn't work either. Common sense. One thing is for sure, that there is no shortcut. Everybody wants the pill to lose weight or to be smarter. There is no such a thing. It's a work in progress. So, and that also applies, to healthy aging, including mental aging. You keep exercising your brain, you're going to stay healthy.
Yeah, and a couple of points I'll pull out. I agree with all of that. I think that on the mental health side, sleep hygiene is really, really important. I think we underestimate how important sleep is to our mental health, but also probably to other body systems. And exercise is something that's pretty powerful on the front of anxiety, depression, and some of the best data that we have in treating some of these mental health conditions in general, not necessarily celiac, et cetera, is exercise and sleep. So I think a healthy lifestyle is important to the diet for sure. Yeah, can be helpful.
There was a comment about, yes, omega-3 is very healthy, a Mediterranean diet. Many people in different parts of the world eat differently, and we are seeing more associations as people eat differently in this country also.
Yeah, I mean, the concept of the food pyramid needs to go out of the window, because that the one fit all doesn't work. It's all, personalized nutrition. The Mediterranean diet is not a diet, it's a lifestyle. Again, these are people that eat a certain way, but they physically work in a certain way. The level of stress is really low. They take a low pace of lifestyle. So it's the package.
Well, thank you, everybody. I think it's time that we have to go. I'm sorry that I did not have time to answer all the questions. I hope that you can get these answered at other times. I want to thank Dr. Kelly and Dr. Fasano for their beautiful talks, all the data and information they gave us, and the responses to the questions. I would like to turn this over now to Chris Rich to conclude.
Well, thank you, Dr. Wolf, and thank you to all of our presenters and attendees for your participation. We hope that all in attendance found this webinar educational and helpful. Please note that if you've registered for continuing education units by filling out the survey that was presented to you in the chat box, these units can take up to 45 days to be received. Also, please remember that the recording of this and all past webinars in the All Things Celiac series can be found at nationalceliac.org. We encourage you to keep an eye on the Harvard Medical School and National Celiac Association websites and social media accounts for updates and additional information about the timing of future All Things Celiac webinars. On behalf of all of our esteemed guests and from all of us here, we look forward to seeing you next time, and thank you for your continued support.